My name is Sarah Chen, and at 34, I'd spent the last 2 years learning that the family court system cares more about who has the better lawyer than who's actually the better parent. I was hunched over my laptop in my cramped studio apartment, trying to make sense of a client's financial mess for the freelance bookkeeping gig that barely covered rent, when the pounding started. Not knocking, pounding. The kind of desperate hammering that meant either someone was dying or the building was on fire. Through the peephole, I saw him. Michael Patterson stood in my hallway looking like he'd been hit by a truck, then backed over for good measure. His usually perfect dark hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled beyond recognition, and his face held an expression I'd never seen in our 7 years of marriage or 2 years of bitter divorce aftermath, pure unfiltered panic. My hand hesitated on the deadbolt. The same man who'd systematically destroyed me in court, who'd convinced a judge I was mentally unstable while presenting himself as the picture of paternal responsibility, was now standing outside my door looking like he'd been sleeping in his car. Against every rational instinct I possessed, I opened the door. Sarah, thank God. His voice cracked, and I noticed his hands were shaking. I need to talk to you. It's about Emma and James. You mean the children you convinced a judge I was too dangerous to see more than 4 hours a month? I stepped back, not inviting him in, but not slamming the door either. The ones you're planning to relocate across the country so I'll never see them again? Look, everything's changed. He ran his hands through his hair, making it even messier. I got the notice about the emergency hearing. Did you get yours? My stomach dropped. The legal document I'd received 3 days ago sat on my kitchen counter, still in its official envelope because I'd been too afraid to fully process what it meant. The custody review? I got it. Then you know we have 72 hours. Michael pushed past me into my apartment without invitation, and I was too stunned by his appearance to stop him. Madison's been arrested. Madison. His girlfriend who'd swooped in during our divorce proceedings, like some kind of sympathetic saint, supporting his claims about my instability while playing devoted stepmother to my children. Arrested for what? Embezzlement. He slumped onto my second-hand couch like a marionette with cut strings. She was taking money from the firm where she worked. Has been for over a year. The irony was so thick I could choke on it. The same firm that somehow funded your endless parade of expert witnesses who testified about my mental state? Sarah, listen to me. His blue eyes, usually cold and calculating during our legal battles, were wide with something that looked almost like fear. During the investigation, they found voice recordings on Emma's phone. Recordings of me discussing the relocation hearing with the kids. My analytical mind, the same one that had served me well as a financial analyst before Michael convinced everyone it made me emotionally unstable, started connecting dots at lightning speed. What kind of discussions? The kind that sound bad when taken out of context. He was wringing his hands now, a gesture so unlike his usual composed demeanor that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Emma recorded them without me knowing. Apparently she was uncomfortable with some of the things I was asking her to say. Uncomfortable. My 12-year-old daughter had felt uncomfortable enough with her father's coaching to secretly record him, and now those recordings were sitting in some investigator's evidence files. What exactly were you asking her to say? Look, every parent prepares their kids for court proceedings. It's normal to... Michael. I crossed my arms, letting my voice carry all the exhaustion and fury of 2 years of fighting for scraps of time with my own children. What were you asking Emma to say? He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his expensive shoes that were now scuffed and dirty. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. That you've been calling the school excessively. That your behavior during visits seems erratic. That she and James would feel safer living farther away from you. The words hit me like physical blows, each one precisely targeted at the deepest wound. The fear that maybe, somehow, my desperate attempts to maintain connection with my children had actually pushed them away. And now there's proof that you coached them to lie. It's not that simple. He looked up at me with something that might have been desperation or might have been calculation. With Michael, it was always hard to tell. The recordings were found during an unrelated criminal investigation. There are legal issues with how they can be used. Of course there were. Because even when the universe handed me evidence of his manipulation on a silver platter, the legal system would find a way to make it inadmissible. How much money did Madison steal to fund your custody case? I didn't know the full extent. How much, Michael? The investigation is still ongoing, but preliminary estimates suggest around $40,000 over 18 months. He couldn't meet my eyes. Some of it went to private investigators, expert witnesses, legal consultants. $40,000 to prove I was an unfit mother while I scraped together grocery money and represented myself in court because I couldn't afford an attorney. The beautiful symmetry of it would have been laughable if it wasn't so devastating. And now you're here because your girlfriend's criminal activity might invalidate your custody victory. I sat down across from him, maintaining distance like he was a wild animal that might bolt. What do you want from me, Michael? The relocation approval is preliminary. If you contest it at the emergency hearing, and if these recordings become admissible evidence, he swallowed hard. I could lose custody entirely. For 2 years, I'd dreamed of hearing those words. I'd fantasized about the moment when the truth would finally come out and I'd get my children back. But sitting here watching the man who destroyed my life fall apart in my living room, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, but a cold analytical clarity. So, you want me to agree not to contest the relocation in exchange for what? Shared custody. The words came out in a rush. Real shared custody. 50-50. No more supervised visits, no more restrictions. We can work out a reasonable schedule that lets you have a real relationship with Emma and James. I studied his face, looking for the calculated manipulation I'd learned to recognize during our marriage. Instead, I saw something I'd never witnessed before. Genuine fear. Michael Patterson, the man who'd convinced a judge that my love for my children was evidence of mental instability, was terrified. You're offering me everything I've been fighting for, I said slowly, in exchange for letting you take my children 3,000 miles away. The company transfer is real, Sarah. The kids' schools are already arranged. If we fight this in court and I lose, they'll be thrown into chaos all over again. His lawyer voice was creeping back, trying to frame his desperation as reasonable concern. This way, we can give them stability. Stability. The magic word that had been used to justify keeping me away from Emma and James for 2 years. But as I looked at Michael's wrinkled clothes and shaking hands, I realized something important. Whatever stability he'd constructed was built on lies and stolen money. And now it was crumbling. I need to think about this, I said, standing up to signal the conversation was over. He stood too, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a business card. My attorney's information. If you decide to take the deal, call him directly. We can have papers drawn up before the hearing. I took the card without looking at it. And if I don't take the deal? Then we'll see each other in court. Some of his old confidence flickered back. And Sarah, even with everything that's happened, I still have 2 years of documented evidence about your behavior. Those recordings might hurt me, but your pattern of desperate phone calls to the school, showing up at events you weren't invited to, the concerned reports from teachers, he shrugged. The judge will have to weigh everything. After he left, I sat in my quiet apartment, staring at the legal notice on my counter. 72 hours to decide whether to take a deal that would give me meaningful time with my children, but let Michael escape the consequences of his fraud, or roll the dice in a court system that had already failed me once. But first, I needed to understand exactly what Emma had recorded and why my daughter had felt the need to document her own father's words. Because something told me those recordings contained more than just coaching about court testimony. They contained the truth about who Michael Patterson really was. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through my phone contacts, looking for Robert Hendrick's number. 2 years of representing myself had made me forget what it felt like to have an actual attorney on my side. But if Emma had been recording Michael, I needed someone who understood evidence rules and criminal investigations and all the legal complexities that would make my head spin. Robert answered on the second ring. Sarah, I was wondering when you'd call. You knew about the hearing? I paced around my tiny living room, too wired to sit still. Court monitoring system flagged it yesterday. I've been keeping loose tabs on your case through the automated notifications. His familiar voice carried a note of something I couldn't quite identify. I was hoping you'd reach out before now. Right, because I'd been too proud and too broke to maintain a relationship with the attorney who'd tried to warn me about Michael's tactics from the beginning. Robert, Michael was just here. He said Emma made recordings. She did. Papers rustled in the background. I spent most of last night on the phone with federal prosecutors getting the details. Your daughter recorded conversations with her father about the relocation hearing on her own phone. I stopped pacing. On her own initiative? According to the FBI report, Emma became uncomfortable when Michael was coaching her about what to say to the judge. She started recording without telling him because she didn't know what else to do with her feelings about the situation. Robert's voice softened slightly. She's a smart kid, Sarah. She knew something was wrong. My 12-year-old daughter had better instincts about her father's manipulation than I'd had during 7 years of marriage. The thought made my chest tight with equal parts pride and heartbreak. But Michael said the recordings might not be admissible. He's not wrong. They were discovered during Madison's arrest when investigators did a forensic sweep of all electronic devices in the apartment. Emma's phone was charging in the living room, and when they imaged it for evidence, they found the recordings. Robert paused, and I could practically hear him putting on his lawyer voice. Under normal circumstances, evidence discovered during an unrelated criminal investigation faces significant barriers under the exclusionary rule. Under normal circumstances? That's where it gets interesting. The federal prosecutors called me this morning because their forensic accounting has revealed something remarkable. Papers rustled again. Madison didn't just steal money randomly. The expenditures from the embezzled funds correlate directly with your custody case timeline. I sank onto my couch, the same spot where Michael had sat 12 hours earlier looking like his world was collapsing. What kind of expenditures? Private investigators who documented your movements? Expert witnesses who testified about your mental state? Specialized legal? Consultants who helped craft custody strategies? Robert's voice carried a note of satisfaction that I'd rarely heard. Sarah, they have receipts. Literal receipts showing stolen money being used to fund a campaign against you. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. 2 years of being told I was paranoid, that my ex-husband's resources were just part of good legal representation. And now there was proof that he'd used criminal proceeds to destroy my relationship with my children. Does that make the recordings admissible? Potentially. If the prosecutors can prove Michael committed fraud upon the court by using stolen funds to present fabricated evidence, then Emma's recordings become relevant to proving that fraud. Robert's tone shifted to something more cautious. But Sarah, there's something else. Michael filed counter motions yesterday. My stomach dropped. Of course he had. Even in his desperation, Michael Patterson was still 3 moves ahead. What kind of counter motions? He's claiming you've been stalking the family and violating the custody order, and he's got documentation to support it. Documentation of what? But even as I asked, I already knew. Phone logs showing 47 calls to the school in the past month. Time-stamped photographs of you near school grounds, taken by those private investigators. Witness statements from teachers describing your behavior as concerning and intense. Robert's voice was gentle but firm. Sarah, every desperate attempt you made to maintain connection with your children, every time you called to check on them or showed up at a school event hoping to catch a glimpse of them, he documented it all. The room started to feel smaller. He turned my love for my children into evidence that I'm dangerous. Worse than that, the federal investigation revealed that Michael has been systematically contacting your family members and friends for the past 6 months, expressing concerns about your mental health and stability. What do you mean contacting them? Carefully orchestrated conversations where he positions himself as a worried ex-husband who's concerned about your well-being. He'd call your sister Lisa to ask if she'd noticed you seeming more stressed lately. He'd run into your former colleagues and mention how the divorce had been hard on you, and he was worried about your stability. Robert's voice carried genuine anger now. He created a network of people who now question your fitness as a mother, and he did it so subtly that they don't even realize they've been manipulated. I thought about my last conversation with Lisa, how she'd seemed hesitant and worried, how she'd suggested maybe I should consider therapy, how she'd said Michael had mentioned his concerns about my well-being when he'd run into her at the grocery store. He's been playing a long game. 18 months, according to the phone records they pulled. He's been building this case against you since before the initial custody modification was even finalized. The magnitude of it was staggering. While I'd been scrambling to pay rent and cobbling together freelance work and representing myself in court, Michael had been executing a comprehensive strategy funded by stolen money to systematically destroy every relationship I had. Robert, can we win this? The recordings are powerful, and the fraud evidence is compelling. But the exclusionary rule issues are real, and Michael's documentation of your behavior creates reasonable doubt about your stability. He was quiet for a moment. Sarah, I need you to understand something. Even if we can get the recordings admitted, even if we can prove fraud upon the court, the judge is still going to weigh everything against 2 years of documented evidence that you've been unable to respect boundaries. So what are you saying? I'm saying that Michael Patterson used stolen money to turn your grief into evidence of your unfitness, and even with proof of his crimes, the legal system might still decide he was right about you being unstable. I closed my eyes, trying to process the cruel mathematics of family court. What's our next move? I'm meeting with the federal prosecutors tomorrow morning to understand exactly what evidence they're willing to share and whether they'll support our fraud upon the court argument. We need to file our own emergency motions before the hearing, and we need to be prepared for the possibility that none of this will be enough. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment staring at my phone, thinking about Emma secretly recording her father because she knew something was wrong. My daughter had more courage at 12 than I'd managed in 2 years of legal battles, but Robert's words echoed in my head. Michael had documented every desperate phone call, every time I'd lingered near the school hoping to see my children. Every moment of grief-driven behavior that proved I was exactly the kind of unstable ex-wife who couldn't be trusted with custody. Even if the truth came out, even if everyone finally saw Michael's manipulation for what it was, the careful web of evidence he'd constructed around me might be stronger than any recording Emma had made. He'd spent 18 months and $40,000 in stolen money to prove I was dangerous. And the terrifying part was, he might actually succeed. The realization hit me like ice water. If the legal system wouldn't expose Michael's lies, I'd have to do it myself. I stared at my phone for 20 minutes before texting him. Need to discuss relocation logistics. Can we meet tomorrow? I don't want to fight anymore. His response came back in 30 seconds. Coffee shop on Pine Street, 2 p.m. Of course he'd pick somewhere public. Michael never did anything without calculating the optics. I spent the next morning researching recording laws and downloading apps, my hands trembling as I tested voice quality and file sizes. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was planning to do exactly what Emma had done. Document her father's words because something was fundamentally wrong. The coffee shop buzzed with afternoon energy, students hunched over laptops and business people grabbing late lunches. I spotted Michael immediately at a corner table, and the sight of him made my breath catch. If he'd looked bad at my apartment, he looked absolutely shattered now. His expensive suit hung loose on his frame like he'd lost weight overnight, and his normally perfect hair was unwashed and unkempt. But it was his hands that really shocked me. They were visibly shaking as he gripped his coffee cup, the liquid sloshing slightly with each tremor. "Sarah." He stood as I approached, his voice hoarse. "Thank you for coming." I slid into the seat across from him, my phone already recording in my jacket pocket. "You look terrible. 24 hours until the hearing." He attempted his lawyer's smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. "Been a stressful few days." "I can imagine." I kept my voice neutral, sympathetic even. "Michael, I've been thinking about what you said, about the kids needing stability." His eyes lit up with something that looked almost like relief. "You're considering the deal?" "I'm considering what's best for Emma and James." The lie came easier than I expected. "But I need to understand something first. When you were coaching them about the court testimony?" "Sarah." His legal training kicked in like muscle memory, cutting through his exhaustion. "I need to stop you right there. Any attempt to record this conversation would constitute illegal surveillance under state wiretapping laws. One-party consent doesn't apply when the conversation is initiated under false pretenses with the intent to gather evidence for pending litigation." I felt heat rise in my face. Even desperate and falling apart, Michael Patterson was still 3 steps ahead. "I'm not recording anything. I just want to understand what happened with Emma in those recordings." He studied my face for a long moment, then his phone buzzed. He glanced at it with the kind of desperate hunger I'd only seen in people checking lottery numbers. "My attorney," he muttered, reading the text, "still waiting for the prosecutor's office to clarify their evidence-sharing position. You're scared they'll hand over everything Madison told them. I'm concerned about how all this uncertainty affects the children." But his voice cracked on the word children, and he had to clear his throat. "Which is why I think we should finalize our agreement today." He reached into his briefcase, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and pulled out a manila folder. Inside was a thick legal document that looked like it had been prepared by an army of attorneys. "What is that?" "A restraining order." He set it on the table between us like a chess piece. "Ready to file the moment I walk out of here if necessary." My stomach dropped. "A restraining order for what?" 47 phone calls to the school in 30 days, Sarah. Documented appearances near school grounds on 14 separate occasions. Attempts to contact the children through social media platforms after being specifically prohibited by the custody order. His voice was getting stronger as he recited the evidence, like he was drawing energy from my shock. What you call love, the documentation shows as a clear pattern of harassment and boundary violations. Those were my children's school events. I have a right. You have the rights the court granted you. 4 hours of supervised visitation per month. That's it. He leaned forward, and I could smell the staleness of too much coffee and too little sleep. Every time you showed up at a soccer game, every call you made asking about their homework, every attempt to be more involved than the court allowed, I documented it all. The casual admission was breathtaking. You've been building a harassment case against me for months. I've been protecting my children from their mother's inability to accept reality. But even as he said it, his hands were shaking again. Sarah, you have to understand something. This isn't just about custody anymore. What do you mean? His phone buzzed again, and this time his face went white as he read the message. The federal prosecutors want to interview Emma and James tomorrow morning. About the recordings? About everything. He set the phone down with exaggerated care, like it might explode. They want to understand the full scope of the psychological manipulation allegations. I felt a flicker of hope. Good, let them hear what Emma recorded. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Michael's voice dropped to a whisper. They're not just investigating me, Sarah. They're investigating the entire family dynamic. What Emma recorded, what James might say, what the kid's therapist has documented about their stress levels and emotional responses. The implication hit me like a physical blow. You think they'll recommend removing the children from both of us? I think federal prosecutors don't give a damn about our custody arrangements. They care about whether children have been psychologically damaged by adults who put them in the middle of criminal conspiracy and legal warfare. His composure was cracking again, desperation bleeding through. Do you know what Emma and James told their school counselor last week? I couldn't speak. That they're scared of both of us. That they don't want to talk to investigators because they're afraid anything they say will make everything worse. He ran his hands through his unwashed hair. That they wish they could just live with their Aunt Lisa until all the grown-ups stopped fighting. The coffee shop noise faded to a dull buzz. My children wanted to escape from both their parents. Everything I'd been fighting for, everything I'd convinced myself was about protecting them, had made them want to run away from me entirely. But here's the thing, Sarah. Michael's lawyer voice was coming back, steadier now. I've convinced them that their feelings are your fault. What? Think about it. Who's been calling the school constantly? Who's been showing up at events looking desperate and unstable? Who's been fighting this relocation so hard that it's created chaos in their lives? He leaned back, and for a moment, his old confident smile flickered across his face. I've spent months helping them understand that their stress comes from your inability to let go. My throat felt like it was closing. You turned my children against me. I helped them contextualize their experiences. The clinical language was pure Michael. Emotional manipulation disguised as psychological insight. And you know what? They wrote letters to Judge Williams asking her to let them move to California. Their idea, their words, their request to get away from the situation you've created. The room tilted. Emma and James had asked the judge to let Michael take them away from me, not because he'd coached them, but because they genuinely wanted distance from their mother's desperate attempts to remain in their lives. Those letters will be presented at the hearing, Michael continued. 2 children, ages 12 and 9, expressing in their own words that they feel safer and happier when their mother isn't trying to insert herself into every aspect of their lives. I couldn't breathe. Everything I'd done out of love, every call to check on them, every appearance at their events, every legal filing to protect my relationship with them, had convinced my own children that I was the source of their trauma. So here's my final offer. Michael pulled out another document. You appear in court Thursday morning and read a prepared statement admitting that your emotional instability during our marriage created an unsafe environment for the children. You acknowledge that your post-divorce behavior has been driven by untreated mental health issues rather than legitimate parental concern. And you agree never to contest my parenting decisions or interfere with my relationship with Emma and James. In exchange for what? Once we're settled in California, I'll allow 1 supervised video call per month. And if the children express interest in seeing you in person, we can arrange 1 visit per year during summer break. The deal was so insulting it actually made me laugh. You want me to publicly admit I'm mentally ill so you can give me 1 phone call a month with my own children? I want you to accept reality. His desperation was showing again, his voice getting higher. Sarah, even if those recordings get admitted, even if Madison's testimony exposes everything, what do you think happens next? You think the judge just hands the kids back to you? I think the truth matters. The truth is that you've spent 2 years proving you can't follow court orders or respect boundaries. The truth is that your children are emotionally traumatized by this custody battle, and they've specifically asked to be removed from it. He was leaning forward again, his blue eyes intense. Even if I lose, even if I face consequences for the fraud, do you really think that makes you fit to have custody? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized he was right about one terrible thing. I'd been so focused on proving Michael was a liar that I'd never considered what would happen if we both lost. Take the deal, Sarah. It's the only way you'll have any relationship with your children at all. He left the documents on the table and walked away, leaving me alone with the sound of espresso machines and college students discussing their weekend plans. Normal people living normal lives, while mine imploded in real time. That evening, my phone rang while I was staring at Michael's papers, spread across my kitchen table. Lisa's name on the caller ID made my chest tight. I hadn't talked to my sister since Robert had warned me about Michael's manipulation campaign. Hey. Her voice was careful, cautious, in a way that confirmed my worst fears. Lisa. I closed my eyes. How are David and the kids? They're good. Sarah, I need to talk to you about something. She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear children's voices in the background. Michael called me yesterday. Of course he had. What did he want? He was worried about you, about the hearing and how you're handling everything. Lisa's voice was gentle but distant, like she was talking to someone fragile who might break. He said you've been making some concerning choices lately. Such as? The constant calls to Emma and James's school, showing up at their events when you're not supposed to be there. He's worried you're having some kind of breakdown and you won't get help. I pressed my fingers against my temples, feeling a headache building. Lisa, Michael has been lying about me for 2 years. Why would you believe anything he says? Because I've seen it too. Her words were quiet but devastating. Sarah, you called me 18 times last Tuesday. 18 times in one day, and when I finally answered, you were crying so hard I couldn't understand what you were saying. I was upset about the custody hearing. Yeah, you've been upset for 2 years, and I love you, but... She trailed off, and I could hear her moving to a quieter room. Honey, when was the last time you slept through the night? When was the last time we had a conversation that wasn't about Michael or the kids or the legal case? The questions hit like physical blows because I couldn't answer them. I'm worried that maybe you need help that isn't legal help, Lisa continued. Maybe Michael's right that this whole situation has pushed you past what you can handle on your own. So you think I'm unstable too. I think you're in pain, and pain can make people do things that look unstable from the outside. Her voice was full of love and worry and something that sounded like pity. Sarah, David, and I have been talking, and we think maybe you should consider therapy. Real therapy, not just the support group you mentioned. I hung up without saying goodbye and sat in my dark kitchen, surrounded by Michael's legal documents and my sister's loving concern. Even Lisa, the person who knew me best, who'd supported me through the divorce, who'd watched Michael's manipulation from the beginning, now questioned whether I was mentally stable enough to trust. Michael hadn't just stolen money to fund his custody case. He'd used that money to create a comprehensive narrative about my unfitness that was so convincing, even the people who loved me most had started to believe it. And in 24 hours, I'd walk into a courtroom where that narrative would be presented as objective truth, supported by months of documentation and my own children's written requests to be taken away from me. I'd spent 2 years fighting to prove Michael was a liar, but he'd spent those same 2 years proving that sometimes the most effective lies are built on carefully selected pieces of the truth. My name is Sarah Chen, and at 34, I'd learned that sometimes the truth isn't enough, especially when lies come with receipts, and your love for your children has been weaponized as evidence of your instability. The courtroom felt smaller than I remembered, or maybe I just shrunk over the past 2 years of legal battles. Judge Patricia Williams sat behind her bench with the same careful expression I'd seen during every hearing, while Michael's attorney, a sharp-suited woman named Carol Manning, arranged an impressive stack of documents with the precision of someone building a fortress. Robert sat beside me, his usually confident demeanor subdued as he flipped through his own much thinner file. "Remember," he whispered as Judge Williams called the hearing to order. "We knew this would be an uphill battle." Uphill! Like trying to climb Mount Everest in flip-flops while carrying a refrigerator. "Your Honor," Carol Manning began, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from never having to represent herself in court while living on ramen noodles. "We're here today because Mr. Patterson's employment opportunity in California requires immediate relocation of the minor children. However, Ms. Chen's recent pattern of escalating behavior has created serious concerns about the children's safety and emotional well-being." She gestured to her assistant, who began distributing thick binders to the judge and court clerk. The systematic efficiency of it made my stomach clench. This wasn't a legal argument. It was a coordinated strike. The evidence we're presenting today documents a clear pattern of harassment, boundary violations, and concerning behavior that has escalated significantly since the original custody order was established. Judge Williams opened her binder and began examining the contents, her expression neutral but focused. I caught glimpses of highlighted phone logs, time-stamped photographs, and official-looking documents that made my mouth go dry. Ms. Chen has contacted Jefferson Elementary School 47 times in the past 30 days. Manning continued, reading from what looked like a detailed timeline. These calls included requests for information she had no legal right to access, attempts to schedule conferences she wasn't authorized to attend, and what school administrators described as increasingly agitated conversations when they explained the custody restrictions. I wanted to stand up and scream that those were my children's school events, that I had a right to know if James was struggling with math or if Emma needed help with her science project. Instead, I sat in my second-hand blazer and watched my love for my children get dissected like evidence in a murder trial. Additionally, Your Honor, we have documented proof of Ms. Chen's physical surveillance of the children. Manning nodded to her assistant, who set up a laptop connected to a projection screen. These photographs were taken by licensed private investigators between September and November of this year. The first image appeared on the screen, and my heart stopped. It was me, standing across the street from Jefferson Elementary, partially hidden behind a tree. The timestamp showed 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, exactly when I knew Emma's soccer practice would be ending. I remembered that day because I'd driven past the school after a particularly brutal freelance client meeting, hoping to catch a glimpse of my daughter. This photograph was taken October 15th, Manning continued as more images cycled through, and this one October 22nd, and this one November 3rd. Each photograph showed me in various locations around the school, looking exactly like what I was, a desperate mother trying to steal moments of connection with children who'd been systematically removed from her life. But projected on that screen, enlarged and time-stamped with clinical precision, I looked like a stalker. Ms. Chen's behavior has clearly escalated beyond the emotional to the compulsive, Manning said, and I noticed she'd perfected the art of making concern sound like clinical diagnosis. Teachers report that she appears intense and agitated during her limited interactions. She's been observed lingering in parking lots, following school buses, and attempting to approach the children directly despite clear custody restrictions. Following school buses. They made it sound like I was some kind of predator instead of a mother who sometimes drove the same route as my children's transportation, hoping to see their faces through a window. Robert finally stood up. Your Honor, I'd like to address the context of Ms. Chen's behavior. She's a mother who's been separated from her children through what we now have evidence was a fraudulent custody case funded by embezzled money. Objection, Manning said immediately. The criminal investigation into Ms. Rodriguez's embezzlement is entirely separate from these custody proceedings. Actually, Your Honor, Robert continued, pulling out his own folder, we have recordings made by the child Emma Patterson that directly relate to fraud upon this court. This was it. The moment we'd been building toward. Emma's voice recordings of Michael coaching her and James about what to say to the judge, proof that the entire relocation case was built on manipulation and lies. Judge Williams looked between the attorneys. Mr. Hendricks approached the bench. Robert and Manning both walked to the judge's bench for a whispered conference that lasted several minutes. I watched Robert's shoulders drop as Judge Williams spoke, her voice too quiet for me to hear, but her expression increasingly skeptical. When they returned to their tables, Judge Williams addressed the courtroom. Mr. Hendricks, I've reviewed your motion regarding the electronic recordings, and I'm ruling them inadmissible under the exclusionary rule. My world tilted. What? Robert put his hand on my arm to quiet me, but Judge Williams continued. These recordings were discovered during an unrelated federal criminal investigation. Without proper legal foundation connecting that investigation to these custody proceedings, and without establishing that the evidence was lawfully obtained for purposes of family court review, I cannot admit them. But Your Honor, Roberts tried, the recordings directly relate to fraud upon this court. Mr. Hendricks, I understand your position, but family court cannot become a backdoor for evidence that may have been improperly obtained in criminal proceedings. The exclusionary rule exists to protect constitutional rights, even in custody cases. Even in custody cases, like my children's welfare was somehow less important than legal technicalities. Manning looked like she'd won the lottery. Your Honor, we'd also like to present testimony from school personnel who have interacted with Ms. Chen. For the next hour, I listened to teachers and administrators describe my behavior in careful, professional language that painted me as exactly the kind of unstable ex-wife who couldn't accept reality. Mrs. Peterson, Emma's homeroom teacher, testified that I'd seemed unusually emotional during our brief conversation at the school book fair. Mr. Rodriguez, the school counselor, described my phone calls as persistent and concerning. Each word was technically accurate, but stripped of context. Yes, I'd been emotional at the book fair. It was the first time I'd seen Emma in 3 weeks. Yes, my phone calls had been persistent. I was trying to understand why my children seemed withdrawn and sad during our monthly visits. But presented in Manning's careful sequence, my behavior looked compulsive and frightening. Furthermore, Your Honor, Manning continued, the children themselves have expressed their feelings about this situation. She handed the judge 2 handwritten letters, and my heart shattered before Judge Williams even began reading them. Emma Patterson, age 12, writes, Dear Judge Williams, I know my mom loves me, but I feel stressed when she calls the school so much. It makes me worry that something is wrong. I think it would be better if we moved to California because then maybe everything could be more calm. And James Patterson, age 9, writes, I love my mom, but I don't want to feel worried anymore. Dad says we can visit mom sometimes if we move, and maybe that would be better. Those words hit me like physical blows. My own children asking to be taken away from me. Not because Michael had coached them, at least not in the letters, but because my desperate attempts to remain in their lives had convinced them I was the source of their stress. Manning presented more evidence. Documentation of my violation of the custody order by attending James's school play without permission. Photographs of me sitting in my car outside their neighborhood. Phone records showing I'd called Michael's house 17 times in one evening after Emma missed our scheduled video call. Each piece of evidence was real, accurate, and completely damning when presented without context. The truth was that I'd attended the school play because missing my son's first major performance felt impossible. I'd sat outside their neighborhood because it was the closest I could get to feeling connected to my children. I'd called Michael's house repeatedly because Emma had been crying during our last video call, and he'd hung up on me. But in Manning's presentation, these weren't the actions of a grieving mother. They were evidence of escalating obsession. Your Honor, Manning concluded, Mr. Patterson's company has provided written confirmation that his employment transfer to California is conditional and time-sensitive. The children's new schools are already arranged, their enrollment is pending, and delaying this relocation any further could jeopardize not only Mr. Patterson's career but the family's financial stability. Judge Williams had been taking notes throughout the presentation, occasionally glancing at me with an expression I couldn't read. When Manning finished, she looked at Robert. Mr. Hendricks, do you have evidence to present? Robert stood, and I could see him struggling with how to proceed without the recordings that had been our primary evidence. Your Honor, we maintain that the entire basis for this custody arrangement was fraudulent. While I cannot present certain evidence due to your ruling on admissibility, the federal criminal investigation has revealed that Ms. Rodriguez embezzled significant funds that were used to finance an elaborate campaign against Ms. Chen. Even if that's true, Judge Williams said, how does it address the documented pattern of Ms. Chen's behavior over the past 18 months? It was the question that had been haunting me since my conversation with Michael. Even if everyone knew he was a liar, even if everyone understood the scope of his manipulation, did that change the fact that I'd spent 2 years acting exactly like an unstable ex-wife who couldn't respect boundaries? Robert tried valiantly to reframe my behavior as the natural response of a mother whose children had been stolen through fraud, but without the recordings to prove that fraud, his arguments sounded like desperate excuses. Judge Williams deliberated for less than 10 minutes. Based on the evidence presented today, I'm granting Mr. Patterson's petition for relocation. The children will relocate to California with their father within 14 days. Her voice was matter-of-fact, professional. Mrs. Chen's visitation rights will be modified to 2 supervised visits per year to be arranged through the California family court system. 2 visits per year. Supervised. For children I'd carried for 9 months, raised for 12 and 9 years, and loved more than my own life. Furthermore, Judge Williams continued, I'm ordering that Ms. Chen have no direct contact with Jefferson Elementary School, no presence within 500 feet of school grounds, and no contact with the minor children outside of court-supervised visitation. I heard the words but couldn't process them. Michael had won everything, not just custody, not just relocation, but complete isolation of my children from my presence in their daily lives. This court is adjourned. Outside the courthouse, I walked through a gauntlet of whispers and stares. Parents from Emma and James's school clustered near their cars, watching me with expressions ranging from pity to fear. These were people I'd shared carpools with, parents whose children had played at my house, neighbors who'd seemed friendly during the years when I was still married to the successful attorney. Now they looked at me like I was exactly what Michael had convinced everyone I was, the unstable ex-wife who couldn't let go. Sarah? A voice called out, and I turned to see Jennifer Walsh, another soccer mom whose daughter had been on Emma's team. We'd spent countless Saturday mornings together on sidelines, cheering for our girls. Hi, Jennifer. I tried to smile, but my face felt frozen. She approached cautiously, like I might suddenly become unpredictable. I just wanted you to know that we're all thinking about you during this difficult time. Difficult time. Like my children being stolen from me was equivalent to getting divorced or losing a job. Emma's going to love California, Jennifer continued, her voice carefully bright. And maybe some distance will be good for everyone, you know? Give you time to focus on yourself. Focus on myself. The same phrase Lisa had used, the same sentiment Michael had been spreading through his systematic campaign. Even Jennifer, who'd known me for years, now believed that losing my children was actually what I needed. Take care of yourself, Sarah, she said, and hurried back to her cluster of friends, who immediately leaned in for whispered updates. I drove home through streets that felt foreign, past the elementary school where I was now legally prohibited from going, past the neighborhood where my children lived with their father, who'd used stolen money to prove I was dangerous. My apartment felt smaller when I unlocked the door, cramped and silent, in a way that emphasized how completely alone I was. I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by legal documents and case files and 2 years' worth of evidence that hadn't been enough to overcome Michael's superior strategy. 14 days. In 2 weeks, Emma and James would be living 3,000 miles away, attending new schools, making new friends, and gradually forgetting about the mother who'd fought so hard to remain in their lives that she'd convinced them she was the problem. Michael had been right about one terrible thing. The legal system didn't care about truth when lies came with better documentation. He'd used Madison's stolen money to hire investigators who photographed my grief, experts who testified about my instability, and attorneys who presented my love as evidence of my unfitness. And it had worked perfectly. My phone sat silent on the counter. No calls from Robert with last-minute legal strategies. No texts from Lisa with sisterly support. No messages from friends who now viewed me as the cautionary tale about divorced women who couldn't accept reality. I'd spent 2 years believing that truth would eventually prevail, that the justice system would protect my children from their father's manipulation, that love would be enough to overcome legal technicalities and stolen money. But as I sat in my empty apartment, counting down the days until my children disappeared forever, I realized that conventional legal channels hadn't just failed me. They'd been systematically corrupted by someone with enough money and strategy to turn my strengths into weaknesses and my love into evidence of my danger. 14 days to watch everything I'd fought for slip away? Or 14 days to find another way entirely? Because apparently when the system fails, you have to decide whether to accept that failure or create your own justice. And after everything Michael had taken from me, acceptance wasn't really an option anymore. 3 days after the hearing, I was still sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by legal documents that might as well have been confetti for all the good they'd done me. The 14-day countdown had become 11 days, and I'd spent most of those 72 hours staring at the ceiling and wondering if Emma and James would even remember my voice by Christmas. My phone had been mercifully quiet since the hearing. Robert had called once to discuss appeal options that we both knew were pointless, and Lisa had sent a carefully worded text about taking time to process everything, which was sister speak for, I still think you need therapy more than legal advice. So when my phone rang at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, displaying a number I didn't recognize, my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. Probably another reporter wanting a quote about the unstable mother who'd been legally banned from her children's school. But something made me answer. Maybe desperation, maybe the fact that unknown numbers were the only ones calling anymore. Sarah Chen. My voice came out hoarse from 3 days of barely speaking. Sarah, this is Madison Rodriguez. The voice was tentative, nervous. His ex-girlfriend. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. I sat up straighter, my brain struggling to catch up. Madison Rodriguez. The woman who'd stolen money to fund Michael's custody case, who'd been arrested while I was fighting for my children in court. The last person I'd expected to hear from, and possibly the last person I wanted to. How did you get this number? My attorney gave it to me. He's been monitoring your case as part of my criminal proceedings. She paused, and I could hear traffic in the background. Sarah, I heard about the hearing. About what happened with the relocation. The casual mention of my devastating loss made my chest tight. Congratulations. Your investment paid off perfectly. That's actually why I'm calling. Her voice was shaky now, like she was crying or trying not to. I know you have no reason to listen to me, and I know I'm probably the last person you want to talk to, but I need you to understand something. Understand what? That I had no idea. Not really. Not the scope of what Michael was doing or how he was using the money. She was definitely crying now, her words coming in uneven bursts. When my attorney told me about your hearing, about how Michael got everything he wanted while I'm sitting here facing 3 years in federal prison, I realized I wasn't his partner in this. I was another one of his victims. I almost hung up. The idea that Madison Rodriguez, who'd literally stolen money to destroy my family, wanted sympathy for being manipulated, was so absurd it made my teeth hurt. But something in her voice stopped me. Maybe it was the same desperate quality I'd heard in my own voice for the past 2 years. What do you want, Madison? I want to tell you the truth. All of it. Because sitting in this coffee shop, watching normal people live their normal lives while I wait to find out if I'm going to prison, I keep thinking about your children. Her voice broke on the word children, and I keep thinking about how Michael convinced me I was protecting them when I was actually helping him steal them from their mother. I closed my eyes, trying to process the surreal reality of receiving a confession from the woman who'd funded my destruction. You helped him steal $40,000. No, Sarah, that's what I thought too, until my forensic accountant finished going through everything. She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her moving, maybe walking to somewhere more private. It wasn't $40,000, it was over $200,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. What? $237,000 over 18 months. Michael didn't just have me embezzle money for legal expenses, Sarah. He had me funding an entire operation. My apartment suddenly felt too small, like the walls were closing in. What kind of operation? Private investigators who didn't just document your behavior, but actively researched your family, your work history, your financial records. Expert witnesses who weren't just testifying about general child psychology, but who had detailed psychological profiles of you specifically. Legal consultants who helped craft custody strategies based on comprehensive analysis of your personality and vulnerabilities. Each revelation was like being punched in the stomach. How could you not know how much money you were taking? Because he never told me the total. He'd ask for $5,000 here, $8,000 there, always with detailed explanations of what it was for. A private investigator to document concerning behavior, an expert witness to testify about child psychology, a legal consultant to help with custody strategy. Her voice was getting steadier, like reciting facts was easier than dealing with emotions. He showed me budgets, Sarah. Professional-looking documents that broke down exactly how much each service cost and when the money would be repaid. Repaid with what? His next big case settlement, or a bonus from the firm, or refinancing his house. Madison laughed bitterly. There was always some plausible source of repayment just around the corner. And because I loved him, because I trusted him, because he made me feel like I was helping protect innocent children, I never questioned why the repayment kept getting delayed. I found myself pacing around my kitchen, too agitated to sit still. So you're saying you didn't know you were helping him destroy my custody case? I thought I was helping him protect Emma and James from their unstable mother. The words came out flat, matter of fact. Michael showed me documentation of your behavior, Sarah. Photos of you following school buses. Records of you calling the school obsessively. Reports from teachers about how agitated and intense you seemed. So you believed I was dangerous? I believed what Michael told me, which was that you were having some kind of breakdown after the divorce and were becoming increasingly desperate and unpredictable around the children. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was smaller. He showed me texts you'd sent him, Sarah. Messages that seemed frantic, demanding, like you might be capable of doing something reckless. The texts. I remembered those messages sent during my worst moments of desperation, when Michael would cancel visitation, or Emma would seem withdrawn during our video calls. Messages where I'd begged, pleaded, and yes, probably sounded exactly like the unstable ex-wife Madison was describing. But here's the thing, Madison continued. My attorney just showed me the complete electronic records from Michael's devices. Sarah, he edited those texts before showing them to me. What do you mean, edited? He took your messages and removed context, combined separate conversations, even changed timestamps to make your communications seem more frequent and obsessive than they actually were. Her voice was getting angry now, building energy. He showed me a text where you wrote, I swear to God, Michael, if you keep doing this to them. But he cut off the rest of the sentence. He made it seem like a threat when you were actually saying, if you keep doing this to them, they're going to think divorce means losing their mother. The manipulation was so calculated, so comprehensive, that I had to sit down. Michael hadn't just stolen money to fund his custody case. He'd created an entirely fictional version of me to justify that theft to the woman who was making it possible. Madison, why are you telling me this now? Because my criminal attorney says that unless I can provide evidence that Michael was the mastermind behind the embezzlement, unless I can prove that I was manipulated rather than an equal partner, I'm looking at 3 years in federal prison. Her voice was desperate now. And because when I heard that he got everything he wanted in court while I'm facing prison for making it possible, I realized that he played me exactly the same way he played you. What kind of evidence do you have? Everything. The word came out like a gunshot. Complete financial records showing every transaction, every payment, every fabricated budget he used to justify the theft. Email communications where he directed me to specific amounts for specific purposes. Text messages where he coached me on how to access firm accounts without triggering automatic alerts. I could barely breathe. You have proof that Michael orchestrated the embezzlement? I have proof that Michael Patterson used me as his personal ATM to fund a $250,000 campaign against his ex-wife, and that he convinced me it was legitimate legal expenses necessary to protect his children from their dangerous mother. Madison's voice was getting stronger, more confident. And Sarah, there's something else. What? Emma's recordings. My attorney says they captured a lot more than what was presented in your hearing. My heart stopped. More how? According to the FBI forensic report, Emma recorded multiple conversations over several months, not just the coaching about the relocation hearing. She documented Michael systematically teaching both children how to discuss you, how to respond to questions about their home life, how to express feelings that would support his custody case. How much did she record? Hours, Sarah. Hours of Michael coaching your children about what their mother was like, what they should say about living with him versus living with you, how to explain their emotional responses in ways that would support his narrative. Madison's voice was quiet now, like she understood the magnitude of what she was telling me. Your daughter documented months of psychological manipulation, not just one conversation about a court hearing. The room started spinning. Emma had been recording her father for months, not because she was comfortable with his coaching, but because something about the entire situation had made her so uncomfortable that she'd felt compelled to document it. But the judge ruled the recordings inadmissible. In family court, because they were discovered during an unrelated criminal investigation. But Sarah, family court isn't the only place those recordings matter. Madison's voice was getting excited now, like she was finally seeing a way out. My attorney says that in criminal proceedings, those recordings are directly relevant to proving fraud and conspiracy charges against Michael. Criminal proceedings? The federal prosecutors are interested in Michael as the primary target, not me. If I can prove that he masterminded the embezzlement scheme, that he manipulated me into stealing money for his personal legal campaign, they're willing to offer me a cooperation agreement that could keep me out of prison entirely. I felt something stirring in my chest that I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. What would that cooperation involve? Testifying about everything. The scope of the money involved, Michael's systematic manipulation of me, the fabricated evidence he created to justify the theft, his direct involvement in planning and directing every aspect of the embezzlement. Madison was talking faster now, energy building. And providing complete documentation that proves Michael Patterson used stolen money to corrupt family court proceedings. That sounds like fraud upon the court. That's exactly what it is. And fraud upon the court can invalidate custody orders, Sarah, especially when that fraud is supported by criminal conspiracy and embezzlement charges. My mind was racing, trying to process the implications. If Michael had criminally conspired to steal money for his custody case, if there was documentation proving that conspiracy, if Emma's recordings showed systematic manipulation of the children over months rather than isolated coaching incidents. Madison, why should I trust you? You helped destroy my family. The question hung in the air for a long moment, and when Madison answered, her voice was softer, more vulnerable. Because I have a niece who's Emma's age. Because when my attorney explained what those recordings actually documented what Michael was doing to his own children, I realized that I didn't just help him steal money, Sarah. I helped him abuse Emma and James. Abuse? Systematic psychological manipulation of children to alienate them from their mother isn't custody strategy, it's emotional abuse. And I funded it because I believed his lies about protecting them. Madison was crying again, but her voice was stronger now. I can't take back what I did, but I can make sure Michael faces consequences for what he did to all of us. The phone call was surreal. Sitting in my empty apartment talking to the woman who'd embezzled money to destroy my family while she offered to help me get my children back. But as Madison laid out the scope of Michael's deception, the systematic nature of his manipulation, the comprehensive evidence she could provide, I realized something important. Madison Rodriguez wasn't my enemy. She was another one of Michael's victims, just like me, just like Emma and James. He'd used her love and trust the same way he'd used his children's vulnerability and my maternal desperation. If you provide this evidence, if you testify against Michael, what happens to you? Best case scenario, I get a cooperation agreement that results in probation and restitution rather than prison time. Worst case, I still go to federal prison, but at least Michael goes down with me. Madison's voice was steady now, resolved. But either way, your children will know the truth about what their father did, and you'll have legal grounds to challenge that custody order. 11 days. In 11 days, Emma and James would be living in California unless something dramatic changed. The federal investigation could take months, but fraud upon the court was grounds for emergency custody modification if the evidence was compelling enough. Madison, I need to think about this. I understand. But Sarah, there's something else you should know. She paused, and I could hear her taking a deep breath. My attorney says that if you're willing to work with federal prosecutors, if you're willing to provide testimony about how Michael's behavior affected you and the children, it strengthens the criminal case significantly. You want me to testify against Michael? I want justice for what he did to all of us. And I think you want your children back. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the same legal documents that had been useless 3 days ago. But everything felt different now. Madison's call had revealed that Michael's victory wasn't the end of the story, it was just the end of the first chapter. The man who'd used stolen money to prove I was an unfit mother was about to face federal prosecution for fraud and conspiracy. The evidence that had been inadmissible in family court could be devastating in criminal proceedings. And somewhere in California, Emma and James were living with a father who'd systematically manipulated them for months, while their brave, smart daughter documented it all because she knew something was wrong. Madison Rodriguez had spent 18 months helping Michael destroy my family because she believed she was protecting children from their dangerous mother. Now she was offering to spend the next 18 months helping me prove that the real danger had been the father who'd manipulated everyone who loved him. But trusting Madison meant betting everything on someone who'd already helped steal my children once. It meant believing that the woman who'd embezzled money to fund my destruction was now telling the truth about wanting to help me get them back. 11 days until Emma and James disappeared to California, or 11 days to take evidence of federal crimes to prosecutors who might actually care more about justice than family court technicalities. Because apparently when the family court system fails, criminal justice might be the only path back to your children. And after everything Michael had taken from me, after 2 years of watching him manipulate every system designed to protect families, I was ready to find out what happened when someone finally fought back with evidence instead of emotion. The question was whether I was ready to trust another person who'd already betrayed me once. But looking at those legal documents, thinking about Emma secretly recording her father because she knew his behavior was wrong, remembering James's confused face during our last video call when he couldn't explain why he felt sad. Maybe the question wasn't whether I could trust Madison. Maybe the question was whether I could live with myself if I didn't try. The rest of Tuesday night passed in a haze of coffee and computer screens. After Madison's call, I couldn't sit still anymore, so I'd spread every legal document I owned across my kitchen table and started building something that looked less like desperate flailing and more like actual strategy. Madison had emailed me a sample of the evidence she could provide, just enough to prove she wasn't lying about the scope of Michael's fraud. Bank records showing payments to Bennett Investigative Services and Child Psychology Consultants, LLC. Email threads where Michael gave specific directions about documenting concerning maternal behavior and establishing pattern evidence for custody modification. Most damning was a spreadsheet, apparently created by Michael himself, tracking every stolen dollar and how it supported his legal strategy. Private investigation, $45,000. Expert witness testimony, $38,000. Legal consultation, specialized custody tactics, $67,000. He'd literally budgeted my destruction down to the penny. By 3 a.m., I'd printed everything Madison had sent and organized it into categories that would make sense to prosecutors who'd never heard of either of us. Financial crimes, fraud upon the court, conspiracy, child manipulation. Each section supported by documentation that painted a picture of systematic criminal behavior spanning 18 months. But looking at those neat piles of evidence, I knew paperwork alone wouldn't be enough. Federal prosecutors dealt with white-collar criminals every day, people who used money and influence to manipulate systems designed to protect vulnerable populations. What made this case different was the human cost. The fact that Michael's crimes had specific victims with faces and voices. Emma and James needed to know the truth before they disappeared to California forever. Wednesday morning, I drove past Jefferson Elementary at 7:45 a.m., the same route I'd taken dozens of times during the months when Michael was documenting my concerning behavior. But this time felt different because I wasn't trying to steal glimpses of my children or hoping for accidental encounters. This time, I was committing a crime. The custody order explicitly prohibited any contact with Emma and James outside of court-supervised visitation. Approaching them at school, sending messages, even mailing letters to Michael's house could result in contempt of court charges. After everything I'd been through, violating that order was probably the stupidest thing I could do, which was exactly why I had to do it. I parked across from the school entrance and waited, my heart hammering against my ribs as the parents dropped off their children. Normal families doing normal things while I sat in my car with 2 sealed envelopes, planning to commit a misdemeanor that could land me in jail. Emma appeared first, walking with her usual serious expression, while Michael talked on his phone beside her. Even from a distance, I could see how thin she'd gotten, how her shoulders seemed permanently hunched, like she was protecting herself from something. James bounced along next to them, still young enough that his natural energy overcame whatever stress he was carrying. But he stayed close to Michael in a way that seemed more clingy than affectionate, like he was afraid of being left behind. My children looked small and tired and nothing like the confident, happy kids they'd been before the custody war began. Michael finished his phone call and crouched down to hug them goodbye, the picture of devoted fatherhood. But even from across the street, I could see him talking to them seriously, probably reminding them about something important they needed to remember. More coaching, more management of their thoughts and feelings and reactions. When he stood up and headed back to his car, I made my choice. Emma? James. I called their names as I jogged across the street, not caring who saw or what it looked like. My children turned toward my voice with expressions that shifted from surprise to confusion to something that looked almost like fear. Mom? Emma's voice was cautious, uncertain. What are you doing here? I needed to see you. I knelt down so we were at eye level, trying to memorize their faces because this might be the last time I saw them for months. I know I'm not supposed to be here, but there are things you need to know before you move to California. James looked around nervously. Dad said we're not supposed to talk to you unless it's video call time. I know what Dad said, baby. But sometimes grown-ups make rules that don't make sense, and sometimes you have to break those rules to do what's right. I pulled out the 2 envelopes I'd prepared. These are letters explaining everything that's been happening, everything your dad did to keep us apart. Emma stared at the envelope with her name on it. What do you mean, what Dad did? The money he used to hire lawyers and investigators and expert witnesses came from stealing, Emma. Your dad convinced his girlfriend to take money that didn't belong to them so he could build a legal case against me. I spoke quickly, knowing other parents were starting to notice the reunion happening on school grounds. Remember those recordings you made? The ones where Dad was teaching you what to say to the judge? Her face went pale. How do you know about those? Because you're braver than you know, sweetheart. You recorded those conversations because something felt wrong and you were right to trust that feeling. I handed her both envelopes. Everything's in here. The financial records, the emails, the proof that Dad lied to everyone, including you and James. James was looking between us with growing confusion. I don't understand. Dad said you were sick and that's why we couldn't live with you anymore. I'm not sick, James. I was just a mom who missed her children so much that I made some bad choices trying to stay close to you. I touched his face gently and he didn't pull away. But your dad made worse choices, and now there are police officers and lawyers who want to ask him questions about the money he stole. Police officers? Emma's voice was barely a whisper. The woman who gave him the money is in trouble with the FBI, and she told them that Dad was the one who made her steal it. I stood up, aware that we'd probably been noticed by school security by now. Emma, you need to read everything in those letters. You're old enough to understand what really happened, and you can help James understand too. But what if Dad finds out we talked to you? James asked, his 9-year-old logic focused on immediate consequences. Then he'll probably be very angry, but he's going to be angry about a lot of things very soon. I hugged them both quickly, desperately. I love you more than anything in the world, and everything I did was to try to protect you and stay in your lives. I hope someday you'll understand that. Emma clutched the envelopes against her chest. Are you going to jail? The question was so perceptive, so adult, that it broke my heart. I might. I broke some rules trying to save our family, and there might be consequences for that. But even if that happens, I want you to know that fighting for you was worth any price. A security guard was walking toward us now, his radio crackling with official communications. Time was up. Read the letters tonight when you're alone. And Emma? I looked directly into her serious brown eyes. You didn't do anything wrong by recording Dad. You were protecting yourself and James the only way you knew how, and that was incredibly brave. I walked back to my car before the security guard reached us. my hands shaking as I started the engine. In my rearview mirror, I watched Emma guide James toward the school entrance, both envelopes clutched safely in her backpack. Breaking the custody order had taken less than 5 minutes. Now I had to live with whatever consequences came from giving my children the truth their father had stolen from them. But first, I had evidence to deliver. The FBI field office in downtown Portland occupied 3 floors of a glass building that looked more like a corporate headquarters than a crime-fighting operation. I'd called ahead and spoken with Agent Jennifer Walsh, not the soccer mom Jennifer, apparently federal agents came in common names too, who'd agreed to meet with me about financial crimes related to ongoing family court proceedings. The waiting room had the kind of institutional furniture that suggested serious business, conducted by serious people. I sat with my carefully organized evidence folders, trying not to think about how surreal it was to be voluntarily walking into a federal building to report crimes committed against my own family. Agent Walsh turned out to be a woman in her 40s, with graying hair and the kind of tired eyes that suggested she'd seen every variation of human greed and manipulation. She listened while I explained Michael's custody case, Madison's embezzlement, and the systematic fraud that had destroyed my family. "Mrs. Chen, I want to be clear about something from the start," she said when I finished my summary. "We're not family court mediators. We investigate federal crimes. Your custody battle, regardless of how unfairly it was conducted, isn't our jurisdiction unless criminal law was violated." That's exactly what I'm reporting. Criminal law violations. I opened my first folder. Conspiracy to commit embezzlement, fraud upon the court, witness tampering through financial incentives, criminal use of stolen funds to manipulate judicial proceedings. She examined Madison's financial records, her expression growing more interested as she tracked the scope and systematic nature of the theft. This is significantly more money than Ms. Rodriguez initially reported, because she didn't know the full scope until her forensic accountant finished going through everything. Michael convinced her each payment was an isolated legal expense, not part of a comprehensive criminal conspiracy. I pulled out the email communications Madison had provided. These show Michael directing specific payments for specific purposes, all designed to support his custody case. Agent Walsh read through several emails, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "Ms. Chen, assuming we pursue federal charges against Mr. Patterson, are you prepared to testify about how these crimes affected you and your children?" "I'm prepared to testify about anything that helps ensure he faces consequences for what he did. What he did includes manipulating you into behaviors that supported his custody case. Are you prepared to admit under oath that some of your actions during this custody battle were problematic, even if they were the result of his manipulation?" The question was fair but painful. "Agent Walsh, I spent 2 years acting like exactly the kind of desperate, unstable ex-wife Michael was trying to prove I was. I violated boundaries, made poor decisions, and let my emotions drive my behavior in ways that ultimately hurt my children." I met her eyes directly. "But I did those things because a criminal conspiracy had stolen my children and convinced everyone, including me, that I was dangerous. Yes, I'm prepared to testify about all of it." She made more notes, then looked up with what might have been approval. "We'll need complete financial records from Ms. Rodriguez, documented communications between her and Mr. Patterson, and testimony from both of you about the scope and timeline of the conspiracy. Madison's attorney is prepared to provide everything in exchange for a cooperation agreement. We'll discuss that separately. Ms. Chen, there's something else you should understand." Agent Walsh leaned forward slightly. "If we prosecute Mr. Patterson for fraud upon the court, if we can prove he criminally manipulated family court proceedings, that creates grounds for those proceedings to be invalidated." My heart stopped. Invalidated how? Custody orders based on fraudulent evidence can be overturned. If your ex-husband used stolen money to build his entire legal case, if he systematically corrupted the judicial process through criminal conspiracy, that's grounds for emergency custody modification regardless of your previous legal defeats. The room seemed to tilt. "You're saying I could get my children back?" "I'm saying that criminal fraud invalidates civil proceedings. Whether you get your children back depends on family court decisions that are separate from our investigation. But proving criminal conspiracy certainly strengthens your position." After leaving the FBI office, I drove directly to the State Bar Association building, where I filed a formal ethics complaint against Michael Patterson. Attorney misconduct, conspiracy to commit fraud, violation of professional responsibility standards, and criminal activity that reflected poorly on the legal profession. The woman who took my complaint, a stern-looking attorney named Helen Morrison, reviewed the same evidence I'd shown Agent Walsh with the focused attention of someone who'd spent years dealing with lawyers who'd forgotten their ethical obligations. Ms. Chen, these are serious allegations that could result in disbarment proceedings, she said, making copies of everything I'd brought. Are you prepared for the possibility that Mr. Patterson will claim these charges are retaliatory given your recent custody dispute? I'm prepared for him to claim whatever protects his interests. But the evidence speaks for itself. I pulled out one final document, Emma's simplified explanation of her recordings that I'd included in her letter. My 12-year-old daughter felt compelled to document her father's behavior because she knew something was wrong. If a child can recognize that coaching testimony and manipulating emotions is inappropriate, surely the state bar can as well. Morrison examined Emma's statement, her expression growing grimmer. Child manipulation in service of legal strategy isn't just unethical, it's potentially criminal. We'll expedite our investigation given the federal charges you've mentioned. By Thursday evening, I'd filed complaints with every relevant authority: the FBI, the State Bar Association, the Family Court Clerk's Office, and Child Protective Services. Each agency had accepted my evidence and opened investigations that could result in criminal charges, professional sanctions, custody modifications, or child welfare interventions. I'd also committed a misdemeanor by contacting my children in violation of a court order, and I'd bet everything on the hope that federal prosecutors would care more about justice than family court technicalities. Robert called me that night after word of the investigations had reached him through legal networking channels that apparently moved faster than official communications. Sarah, what have you done? His voice was equal parts impressed and terrified. I've reported criminal activity to the appropriate authorities. I was sitting at my kitchen table again, but this time surrounded by receipt copies and contact information for 6 different government agencies. Robert, Michael stole almost $250,000 to destroy my family. That's not a custody dispute, it's organized crime. Do you understand that you'll probably face criminal charges for violating the custody order? Do you understand that I don't care anymore? The words came out sharper than I intended, but they were true. Robert, I've spent 2 years playing by rules that were rigged against me from the beginning. Michael used stolen money to hire the best investigators, the most convincing expert witnesses, and the most sophisticated legal strategy that fraud could buy. So you decided to bet everything on cooperation with federal prosecutors? I decided to bet everything on the truth finally mattering more than money. I looked at the evidence folders, still organized into neat piles that documented every aspect of Michael's criminal conspiracy. Emma spent months recording her father because she knew his behavior was wrong. Madison stole money for 18 months because she believed she was protecting children from their dangerous mother. I spent 2 years acting desperate and unstable because that's exactly how someone acts when their children are being stolen through systematic fraud. Robert was quiet for a long moment. Sarah, even if everything works out, even if Michael faces consequences and you get the kids back, this process is going to be brutal. Federal investigations take months. Criminal trials can last years. Are you prepared for that? Are Emma and James prepared to spend those years with a father who systematically manipulated them for his own legal benefit? I stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the neighborhood where my children no longer lived. Robert, I know this is a gamble. I know I might face criminal charges. I know the federal investigation might not result in the outcome I'm hoping for. But doing nothing was guaranteed to result in my children disappearing to California with someone who convinced a federal investigation that he's a criminal. At least this way, there's a chance for justice. And if you end up in prison, then my children will know that their mother fought for them with everything she had, even when fighting meant risking everything she had left. I turned away from the window, back toward my evidence folders. Robert, Emma recorded her father for months because something felt wrong to her. She's 12 years old and she documented criminal behavior because her instincts told her to protect herself and James. What's your point? My point is that if my daughter was brave enough to gather evidence when she felt unsafe, then I can be brave enough to present that evidence when she needs justice. I sat back down, feeling calmer than I had in months. Whatever happens to me, at least Emma will know that having courage to do the right thing runs in our family. After I hung up with Robert, I called Madison to confirm that she was ready to provide everything she'd promised. Her cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors had been finalized that afternoon, contingent on her complete honesty about Michael's role in the embezzlement scheme. Sarah, are you sure about this? She asked, her voice carrying the same exhaustion I felt. Once we do this, once we testify against Michael, there's no going back. There was no going back the moment you called me, I said. Madison, in 6 days my children are supposed to move to California with someone who might be facing federal charges. Whether we're sure about this or not, We're out of time for alternatives. What if he retaliates? What if exposing him makes things worse for Emma and James? It was the question I'd been avoiding since I'd handed my children those letters. Then we deal with those consequences when they happen. But Madison, what's the alternative? Let him disappear to California with kids he's been systematically manipulating? Let him start over in a new state where nobody knows about the fraud and embezzlement? You're right, she said quietly. I just keep thinking about how much damage I've already caused by trusting the wrong person. You're about to cause a lot more damage by trusting the right people, I told her. The difference is that this time, the damage is going to fall on someone who deserves it. Friday morning, I received confirmation that all my complaints had been accepted and initial investigations were underway. The FBI was treating Michael as their primary target. The State Bar Association had opened expedited disciplinary proceedings. Family Court had scheduled an emergency hearing to address potential fraud upon the court. I also received a call from Agent Walsh confirming that Emma's recordings, combined with Madison's financial evidence, had provided sufficient grounds for federal prosecutors to consider criminal charges against Michael. Ms. Chen, I want you to understand that this process will be lengthy and complex, she said. Federal investigations don't operate on family court timelines. I understand. But Agent Walsh, my children are supposed to leave the state in 5 days. Is there any way to expedite initial proceedings that might affect their relocation? We're discussing emergency measures with the family court. If we can establish probable cause for criminal charges, that creates grounds for preventing interstate relocation of potential witnesses in an ongoing federal investigation. Potential witnesses. Emma and James weren't just victims of their father's manipulation. They were witnesses to federal crimes. Their recordings, their experiences, their testimony could be crucial evidence in proving criminal conspiracy and fraud. Michael couldn't take key witnesses in a federal investigation to California, even if he still had custody. That afternoon, my phone rang with a call I'd been expecting since I'd approached my children at school. Sarah. Michael's voice was deadly calm, the tone he used when he was furious but trying to maintain control. We need to talk. I don't think we have anything to discuss, Michael. You violated the custody order. You approached my children on school grounds despite being explicitly prohibited from any contact outside supervised visitation. His lawyer voice was back, precise and threatening. That's contempt of court, Sarah. Criminal contempt. Add it to the list of criminal charges being filed this week. Silence on the other end, then. What are you talking about? I'm talking about federal prosecutors who are very interested in your financial arrangements with Madison Rodriguez. I'm talking about the State Bar Association investigating ethics violations related to criminal conspiracy. I'm talking about Child Protective Services wanting to understand how you convinced your own children to request removal from their mother's custody. Sarah, you're making a serious mistake. The only mistake I made was trusting the family court system to protect my children from someone who was systematically defrauding it. I was pacing again, energy building as I finally got to say everything I'd wanted to say for 2 years. Michael, did you really think Madison would go to federal prison alone? Did you honestly believe that stealing $250,000 wouldn't eventually get noticed by someone who cared more about justice than custody politics? Whatever Madison told you, whatever lies she's spreading to reduce her own criminal liability, she's spreading financial records, Michael. Email communications, bank statements, documentation that proves you orchestrated 18 months of criminal conspiracy to steal your own children. My voice was getting stronger, more confident. She's spreading evidence that's going to land you in federal prison while I get my kids back. Another long silence, then Michael's voice returned, quieter but more menacing. Sarah, if you think federal prosecutors care about your custody concerns, you're delusional. If you think criminal charges against me automatically restore your parental rights, you're setting yourself up for devastating disappointment. Maybe, but at least my children will know the truth about what their father did to our family. The truth? Michael laughed bitterly. The truth is that you spent 2 years proving you're exactly the kind of unstable, boundary-violating parent who shouldn't have custody of anyone's children. Criminal charges against me don't change your documented pattern of concerning behavior. You're right, I said, and I could hear his surprise at my agreement. I did spend 2 years acting unstable and desperate and boundary-violating. But I acted that way because your criminal conspiracy was systematically destroying my relationship with my children while making me look dangerous for fighting back. Sarah, I'm not finished. For the first time in 2 years, I was the one controlling our conversation. Michael, you convinced Madison to steal money by making her believe I was dangerous. You convinced teachers and counselors that my behavior was concerning by documenting it out of context. You convinced Emma and James that their stress came from their mother's instability rather than their father's manipulation. So now federal prosecutors get to hear about how systematic manipulation can make normal people act unstable. Madison gets to testify about how you convinced her that funding your custody case was protecting children. Emma gets to explain why she felt compelled to secretly record her own father. Michael was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its threatening edge. "What do you want, Sarah?" "I want justice. I want my children back. I want you to face consequences for what you did to all of us." I stopped pacing and sat down, feeling calmer than I had in months. "But most of all, Michael, I want Emma and James to understand that when someone hurts your family, you fight back with everything you have, even when fighting seems impossible. You'll go to prison for violating the custody order. Maybe, but you'll go to prison for violating federal law, and I'll still be their mother when we both get out." After I hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment surrounded by the evidence of the most reckless, desperate, and necessary thing I'd ever done. In less than a week, I'd gone from defeated ex-wife accepting scraps of supervised visitation to federal witness betting everything on criminal justice where family court had failed. I'd violated court orders, risked criminal charges, and trusted someone who'd already betrayed me once. I'd given my children information that would shatter their understanding of their father and force them to question everything they'd been taught about their mother. But sitting there in the late afternoon light, thinking about Emma secretly recording conversations because she knew something was wrong, thinking about James asking confused questions because his father's coaching didn't match his own feelings, thinking about Madison sitting in coffee shops, waiting to find out if she was going to prison for helping someone she'd loved, I realized that sometimes justice doesn't come from working within systems. Sometimes it comes from exposing why those systems failed in the first place. And sometimes, when you've lost everything that matters, the only rational choice is to risk everything that's left. Michael Patterson had used stolen money to prove I was an unfit mother. Now, federal prosecutors would decide whether using stolen money to manipulate judicial proceedings made him an unfit human being. Either way, Emma and James would finally know the truth about why their family fell apart. And after 2 years of being told that my love for them was evidence of my instability, they'd understand that fighting for your children with everything you have isn't dangerous. It's exactly what good mothers do when the system fails and their children need them most. The evidence was submitted. The investigations were underway. The gamble was made. Now I just had to wait to find out whether justice delayed was justice denied, or whether sometimes the truth really is worth any price. My name is Sarah Chen, and at 34, I'd learned that winning sometimes looks a lot like losing until you understand what victory actually costs. 8 months after I'd bet everything on federal prosecutors caring more about justice than family court politics, I was sitting in Dr. Rebecca Martinez's office, watching my 12-year-old daughter explain to a therapist why she felt guilty for secretly recording her father's conversations. "I knew something was wrong," Emma said, her voice small but steady. "But I also knew Dad would be angry if he found out I was documenting what he said. So I kept doing it anyway, even though it felt like lying." Dr. Martinez, a patient woman with kind eyes who specialized in helping families recover from systematic manipulation, leaned forward slightly. "Emma, can you help me understand what made you feel like something was wrong?" The coaching didn't match how I actually felt about Mom. Emma glanced at me, then back at the therapist. "Dad would tell us that Mom was unstable and dangerous, but when I was with her, she just seemed sad and worried. Like she missed us but was trying not to show it." James, now 10 and still struggling to articulate his confusion, fidgeted in his chair beside his sister. "I don't understand why Dad had to lie about Mom to make us want to live with him. If living with him was better, wouldn't we have just known that?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to every adult who'd failed to protect these children from their father's systematic manipulation. Dr. Martinez had told me during our first session that children of parental alienation often asked devastatingly logical questions that revealed the fundamental cruelty of what had been done to them. "That's a very insightful question, James," Dr. Martinez said. "What do you think the answer might be?" "I think maybe Dad was scared that if we knew the truth about what he was doing, we wouldn't want to live with him anymore." James looked at me with the kind of adult wisdom that no 10-year-old should possess. And maybe he was right about that. These Thursday afternoon sessions had become our routine since the kids came home 3 months ago, after Michael's criminal conviction had provided the legal foundation for emergency custody modification. The family court judge who'd originally awarded Michael everything had been forced to acknowledge that custody orders based on fraudulent evidence were invalid, especially when that fraud involved federal crimes. But legal victories, I discovered, were much cleaner than emotional ones. Mom, Emma said, turning toward me with the serious expression she'd worn too often for a 12-year-old. Dr. Martinez says we should talk about how we feel about you going to court and everything that happened after. This was the part of therapy I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The part where my children and I had to acknowledge the choices I'd made to bring them home, including the criminal charges I'd faced for violating the custody order. What would you like to know? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral and supportive. Were you scared when you had to go to court for breaking the rules about contacting us? James asked. Terrified, I said honestly. I was scared I might go to jail, scared that breaking those rules might make things worse for all of us, and scared that you might think I was actually as unstable as your father said I was. But you did it anyway, Emma observed. I did it anyway because the alternative was watching you disappear to California with someone who was using stolen money to manipulate our family. I looked at both of them, these brave, damaged children who were slowly learning to trust their own perceptions again. Sometimes when systems fail to protect the people you love, you have to choose between following rules and doing what's right. Dr. Martinez had warned me that this conversation would happen eventually, that children needed to understand their parents' choices even when those choices involved criminal behavior. The plea deal I'd accepted had resulted in 6 months of community service and 2 years of probation, consequences that could have been much worse if federal prosecutors hadn't acknowledged that my violations occurred in the context of exposing Michael's systematic fraud. Emma, James, how do you feel about the choices your mother made? Dr. Martinez asked. Emma was quiet for a long moment, her analytical mind working through complex emotions. I'm glad she fought for us, even when it was scary, but I'm also angry that she had to break laws to make people listen to the truth. What are you angry about specifically? I'm angry that the grown-ups who were supposed to protect us believed Dad's lies, instead of investigating why a 12-year-old felt like she needed to secretly record her own father. Emma's voice was getting stronger, more confident. I'm angry that Mom had to risk going to jail to prove that Dad was using stolen money to steal us. James nodded vigorously. And I'm angry that we believed Dad when he said Mom was dangerous, because now I know that he was the dangerous one. These sessions were simultaneously heartbreaking and hopeful, watching my children process trauma while rebuilding their ability to trust their own judgment. The recordings Emma had made, initially ruled inadmissible in family court, had become crucial evidence in Michael's criminal trial, where they proved his systematic coaching and manipulation extended far beyond the relocation hearing. The voice recordings, combined with Madison's financial evidence and testimony, had painted a comprehensive picture of criminal conspiracy that resulted in Michael's conviction on multiple federal charges. The judge who sentenced him to 3 years in federal prison had specifically noted that manipulating children to testify against their mother represented a particularly egregious form of fraud upon the court. Dr. Martinez, I said, could you help the kids understand what happened to Madison and why her cooperation was important? Dr. Martinez nodded. Emma, James, you remember that your father's girlfriend Madison was the one who provided the money for his legal case, right? She stole it from her work, Emma said matter-of-factly. That's right, but what's important to understand is that she stole it because your father convinced her that your mother was dangerous and that the money was necessary to protect you. Dr. Martinez spoke, carefully, helping them understand the complexity of manipulation. Madison thought she was helping save children from an unstable parent. She didn't know she was actually helping someone steal children from a loving mother. So she was tricked too? James asked. She was manipulated the same way you were, just with different information and different emotions, I explained. Madison loved your father and wanted to protect children, so he used that love and protectiveness to convince her to break the law for him. Emma frowned thoughtfully. Is that why she told the truth about Dad in court? Because she figured out he was lying to her too? Partly, yes, but also because when Madison understood what Dad had really done, she realized that keeping his secrets would mean letting him hurt other families the same way he hurt us. I looked at my daughter, this remarkable child who documented months of manipulation, because her instincts told her something was wrong. Madison made mistakes, but when she understood the truth, she chose to help fix the damage, even though it meant going to prison herself. The complexity of Madison's situation had been one of the hardest things for the kids to understand. She'd served 4 months in federal prison despite her cooperation, because financial crimes carried mandatory minimums, even for manipulated accomplices. But her testimony had been crucial in proving that Michael orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme specifically to fund his custody case. Kids, Dr. Martinez said, I want to ask you something important. How are you feeling about living with your mom again? What's been challenging and what's been good? Emma and James exchanged a look that reminded me how much they'd had to rely on each other during the 18 months of systematic manipulation. It's good, but it's also confusing, Emma said finally, because we spent so long being told that mom was the problem that sometimes my brain still expects her to act unstable or scary, even though she doesn't. Like when she makes dinner, part of me is surprised that it's normal food instead of crazy food, James added with the brutal honesty of childhood. Because Dad said Mom couldn't take care of us properly. The words stung, but Dr. Martinez had prepared me for this kind of revelation. Children who'd been systematically coached to fear a parent needed time to unlearn those false expectations, even after they intellectually understood they'd been manipulated. Have there been moments when you felt worried about living with Mom again? Dr. Martinez asked gently. The first night, I kept waiting for her to do something that proved Dad was right about her being unstable, Emma admitted, not meeting my eyes. But she just made us hot chocolate and helped with homework and acted like a regular mom. And how did that make you feel? Sad that I'd been expecting her to be different than she actually was, and angry that Dad made me afraid of my own mother for no reason. Emma's voice was getting harder. The anger that Dr. Martinez said was a necessary part of healing. It made me realize how much time we lost being scared of the wrong person. James nodded solemnly. I missed Mom, but I also felt guilty for missing her because Dad said missing her meant I didn't love him enough. These were the conversations that happened in Dr. Martinez's office, while the broader consequences of my choices continued to unfold in the community around us. The federal investigation and criminal trial had been front-page news in our small city, creating a scandal that touched everyone who'd been part of the original custody proceedings. Some community members had approached me with apologies for believing Michael's narrative about my instability. Others still viewed me with suspicion, unable to separate my legal vindication from their discomfort with the criminal behavior that had surrounded my family. The parents at Jefferson Elementary treated me with careful politeness that suggested they weren't sure whether I was a victim who deserved sympathy or a troublemaker who'd brought chaos to their children's school. My professional reputation had taken significant damage as well. Potential clients researching my background found news articles about custody violations and federal investigations before they found information about my analytical skills and work experience. I'd been forced to take contract work at lower rates while slowly rebuilding credibility in a field where trust and reliability were essential. But sitting in Dr. Martinez's office, watching my children slowly reclaim their ability to trust their own perceptions and emotions, I knew that every professional consequence and community judgment had been worth it. Dr. Martinez, Emma said, I want to understand something about what happened to Dad. What would you like to know? Is he in prison because he stole money, or because he lied about Mom, or because he coached us to say things that weren't true? Dr. Martinez looked at me, checking whether I was ready for this conversation. I nodded. Your father is in prison because he committed multiple federal crimes, Dr. Martinez explained carefully. He convinced Madison to steal money, which is called conspiracy to commit embezzlement. He used that stolen money to manipulate court proceedings, which is called fraud upon the court. And he coached you to provide testimony that wasn't based on your actual experiences, which is called witness tampering. So all of it together? James asked. All of it together created a pattern that federal prosecutors called systematic criminal conspiracy, I said. The judge who sentenced Dad said that using children as tools in criminal schemes was particularly serious because children should be protected from adult crimes, not used to commit them. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the same analytical approach she'd inherited from both her parents. So Dad didn't just make bad choices, he planned bad choices for a really long time. That's exactly right, Dr. Martinez confirmed. And Emma, that's why your decision to document his coaching was so important. You provided evidence that helped everyone understand that this wasn't accidental or emotional, but systematic and planned. Will Dad ever be able to have custody of us again? James asked, his voice small. It was the question I'd been dreading because the answer was complicated and painful. Probably not unsupervised custody, sweetheart. When someone uses children in criminal schemes, when they manipulate and coach children to lie to judges, that creates permanent concerns about their judgment and priorities. But he's still our dad, Emma said quietly. He'll always be your father, and you're allowed to love him and feel conflicted about everything that happened, Dr. Martinez said. Many children love parents who make terrible choices. Your feelings about Dad don't have to be simple or clear-cut. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering the kids' anxieties about starting at a new school. I'd decided we needed a fresh start in a different district. Their questions about Madison's release from prison, and their concerns about whether other adults they trusted might also be lying to them. Dr. Martinez had warned me that children who'd experienced systematic manipulation often developed hypervigilance about adult truthfulness, constantly testing whether the people around them were being honest. Emma had started fact-checking my casual statements, while James asked probing questions designed to catch inconsistencies in anything I told him. But as we walked to my car after the session, Emma surprised me with a question I hadn't expected. "Mom, do you think you would have done anything differently if you could go back?" I unlocked the car and considered the question while buckling my seatbelt. "Do you mean about breaking the custody order and contacting you at school?" "About all of it, the whole last 2 years." James leaned forward from the back seat, clearly interested in my answer. "I think I would have documented Dad's behavior more systematically from the beginning," I said honestly. "I would have saved more of his texts and emails instead of deleting them when they made me angry. I would have been more strategic about building evidence instead of just reacting emotionally to each new crisis." "But would you have still fought for us the same way?" James asked. I looked at both of them in the rearview mirror. These resilient children who'd survived 18 months of systematic manipulation and were slowly learning to trust their own perceptions again. "I would have fought for you exactly the same way, sweetheart. Because watching you disappear to California with someone who was using stolen money to manipulate our family wasn't an acceptable outcome, regardless of what fighting back cost me personally." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Good. Because even though everything was scary and confusing, I'm glad you didn't give up on us. I'm glad you recorded Dad even when it felt wrong to you," I told her. "You trusted your instincts when every adult around you was failing to protect you. That was incredibly brave. And I'm glad Madison told the truth even though it meant going to prison," James added with his 10-year-old sense of justice. Because keeping Dad's secrets would have been worse than getting in trouble for telling the truth. As we drove home through the early spring afternoon, past the neighborhood where Michael had lived with the children he'd systematically coached to fear their mother, past the elementary school where I'd once been legally prohibited from going, I reflected on the conversation that had taken place 8 months earlier between Madison and me. She'd asked if I was sure about betting everything on federal prosecutors and criminal justice when family court had failed us. I told her that doing nothing was guaranteed to result in my children disappearing forever, while fighting back at least offered a chance for justice. Now, 8 months later, I understood that justice had come exactly as I'd hoped, through proper legal channels, with criminal accountability for Michael's systematic fraud, and with comprehensive evidence that proved his entire custody. Victory had been built on lies and stolen money. But justice had also come with costs I hadn't fully anticipated. Community suspicion that might never fully fade. Professional consequences that would take years to overcome. A relationship with my sister that remained strained from Michael's manipulation campaign, slowly healing through family counseling but not yet back to its previous closeness. And most significantly, children who were home but damaged, working through complex trauma in therapy sessions where they had to process the reality that their father had manipulated them as tools in his criminal conspiracy. Emma had been forced to grow up too quickly, developing the kind of strategic thinking that 12-year-olds shouldn't need. James struggled with guilt over believing his father's lies about me, even though Dr. Martinez repeatedly explained that children weren't responsible for adult manipulation. But watching them in therapy, seeing them slowly reclaim their ability to trust their own emotions and perceptions, listening to them ask honest questions about complex adult failures, I knew that the truth had been worth any price. Michael Patterson had used $250,000 in stolen money to prove I was an unfit mother. Federal prosecutors had used systematic evidence to prove he was an unfit human being. And somewhere in between those two extremes, my children were learning that loving someone didn't mean accepting their lies, and that fighting for your family sometimes required choices that came with lasting consequences. Dr. Martinez had told me during our first session that recovery from systematic manipulation was measured in years, not months, that Emma and James would probably struggle with trust issues well into adulthood, that I would need to prove my stability and truthfulness consistently over time, not just in dramatic moments. But as we pulled into the driveway of our new apartment, in a district where nobody knew about federal investigations or custody violations, where Emma could attend middle school without classmates whispering about her father's criminal trial, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over 2 years. Peace. Not the absence of problems, because we still had plenty of those, but the peace that comes from knowing you made the right choice, regardless of what that choice cost you. Emma was documenting her homework in a careful notebook, a habit she'd developed after months of feeling like she needed evidence to protect herself. James was chattering about his new soccer team, slowly returning to the carefree energy that systematic manipulation had stolen from him. And I was their mother again, not in the limited, supervised, conditional way that Michael's fraud had created, but in the daily, mundane, taken-for-granted way that healthy families operated. That evening, as I helped with homework and made dinner, and listened to stories about school friends, I thought about the conversation with Michael that had taken place 8 months earlier. He'd warned me that federal prosecutors wouldn't care about my custody concerns, that criminal charges against him wouldn't automatically restore my parental rights, that I was setting myself up for devastating disappointment. He'd been wrong about the first 2 predictions, but right about the complexity of recovery. Getting my children back hadn't been automatic or simple. It had required additional custody hearings, psychological evaluations, family therapy, and months of proving that my previous concerning behavior had been the result of his criminal manipulation rather than inherent instability. But sitting at our kitchen table watching Emma help James with math homework, while they debated whether their father's prison sentence was long enough, I realized that Michael had been completely wrong about the most important thing. The person I'd become to save my children hadn't been a departure from who I really was. It had been the most authentic version of myself I'd ever been. A mother willing to risk everything for her children's safety and well-being. Someone who chose truth over convenience, justice over compliance, and love over rules that had been systematically corrupted by criminal conspiracy. Dr. Martinez had said that trauma could either break families or make them stronger, depending on how they chose to process and integrate their experiences. As I watched my children slowly reclaim their voices and their trust in their own perceptions, I knew that our family was choosing strength. Not perfect strength, not uncomplicated strength, but the kind of resilient strength that comes from surviving the worst thing you can imagine and discovering that love and truth really are more powerful than money and manipulation. Emma looked up from her homework. Mom, I know we're supposed to think about forgiveness and stuff, but I'm not ready to forgive Dad yet. That's okay, sweetheart. Forgiveness isn't something you have to do on anyone else's timeline. Good, she said firmly, because right now I'm more interested in making sure he can't hurt other families the way he hurt ours. James nodded in agreement. And making sure everyone knows that recording grown-ups when they're acting wrong isn't tattling. It's protecting yourself. Looking at my children, these brave survivors who documented their own father's criminal behavior, because their instincts told them to protect themselves and each other, I understood that the most important victory hadn't been legal or financial. It had been raising children who valued truth over loyalty, who trusted their own perceptions over adult authority, and who understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is refuse to accept the unacceptable. Michael Patterson had spent 18 months and $250,000 trying to prove I was an unfit mother. Instead, he'd proved that the children I'd raised were exactly the kind of people the world needed. Brave enough to document injustice, strong enough to survive manipulation, and wise enough to understand that love without truth isn't really love at all, and that more than any legal victory or criminal conviction was worth every risk I'd taken and every consequence I'd accepted. Because the person I'd become to save my children was simply the person I'd always been. Someone who believed that protecting your family from systematic harm was worth any price. And that justice delayed wasn't necessarily justice denied if you were willing to fight long enough and risk everything to make sure the truth finally mattered more than money.